But once we opened that up a little and talked about the journey that many have from certainty to exploration to a greater openness, and then to a willingness to embrace diversity and yet find one's own identity comfortably sitting in that space, I think a lot of people went, oh, that explains it. I see what's happening here.
Welcome to dchurch.com. My name's Jules. This is the second of a three-part presentation talking with Dr. John Capper about going beyond judgment. Welcome.
So talk us through each, and if you can talk us through each of the sections, as it were. That's probably a way to go forward, and then I'll drill down on each of them as you go.
Sure, push me hard. Yeah, look, I deliberately structured this, and think about it again in our lounge room or family room with a dozen people, sitting there. First group, a nervousness because no one's told them to bring a Bible, and so some have and some haven't, and so we've got this sense of what is a church group that doesn't invite you to bring a Bible, a notebook, and a pen kind of thing. And my comment these days is, I'm sorry, I carry my Bible with me all the time because I always have my phone. I have multiple versions. I have the New Testament in Greek if I want it, in multiple translations. I'm not going to contribute to buy Bibles for the pews. The Bible is ubiquitous and yet invisible. So let's bring the text into the open, but not necessarily by having to stop and start with the text, but to let the text liberate us. So that was sort of a background that started us. And then we looked at the question of some people. I described two people, one who has a name that could be male or female, and described some characteristics of them which would have put them into a particular human category, and then said, but in actual fact, this person does this, which is something completely unexpected. And similarly, with another person, we asked a little bit about disability and what that means for how we see each other. And then we sort of started looking a little bit at ourselves in terms of, if you like, ableist and disablest terms, to ask, what do other people make of us? And what do we do that prejudices our relationships? So the style of this, Jules, was to give us 10 minutes of input, 5 minutes of clarification and discussion. We did that 4 times to develop the theme, and then we had a longer conversation at the end, and then coffee and breakfast.
So from that
I joked
session,
about breakfast, by the way, because we didn't have to stay over. We got the thing finished. We're good Anglicans. Back to you.
So what questions did emerge from that first session? Then what things did you discover that people were saying, or that as you taught, it began to occur to you?
When we talked about the experiences of others who've been judged, I think immediately we had 2 or 3 sorts of stories started to emerge. Now, note, the format didn't nurture the significant extended sharing of stories, but clearly what came to the surface were experiences where everybody in the room was nodding their head saying, sure, we've felt like that when we've been pigeonholed, disregarded, we've been highly qualified person but who's happening to volunteer in this place and treated like dirt, this sort of stuff. And clearly a fair bit about families, and a number of folk in the room had gay children, nephews, nieces, cousins, aunts, whatever, who they were able to recognise how they'd been treated. We didn't get a long way down the track of how we treated each other, but we clearly entered into that space of what it means to be judged for who we are or who we're perceived to be, and on that basis not taken seriously.
So there's a sense in which you're first empathizing, self-identifying with the experience of being judged.
Yeah, and I don't think that had been my direct intention. It was simply to open up that as conversation, but I think it became a little bit confronting even at that early point, perhaps more than I'd expected it might be.
Yeah.
And we talked about the complexity that comes with that, and then we did move on to talking about how particular conflicts of the past get played out in matters of serious human judgment, one person of another. So I used the fairly complex case of John Calvin and Michael Servetus and their theological disagreement. And some would argue that it was Calvin who led to the death of Michael Servetus, his sort of judicial murder, if you like. I don't think that's a fair description, but it was a hostile relationship over a matter of faith. And yet, there was certain respect of each other's person. So it's interesting then that sometimes history imports judgment at a human level to make it easier to deal with outcomes that were probably not to do with interpersonal conflict, but that were about other areas of power, powers and principalities, if you like, the other things that swirl around.
Yes.
So we sort of tried to open it up a bit to how these areas become complicated. I don't know if that's helpful. Then we compared that, by the way, to Charles Wesley, who was invited to reprove Hal Harris, the predestinationist Welsh preacher, his contemporary. He said that he'd say nothing about Hal Harris because the danger was he'd say so many good things that the audience would become bored. Which is rather lovely, isn't it? Perhaps facetious, and the disagreement would be well known. But the point is, he was not going to go out to condemn a brother or another human being. He was going to stick with the things that mattered.
I'm very much reminded of when I did some anthropology with Wycliffe Bible translators, and one of the first things I remember being taught was when you go to a different culture, it's not wrong, it's just different.
Just different.
And so you, as you would say, perhaps suspend judgment. You try and find a healthy space of learning in your mind, in your emotions, and in your response to situations. And in certain cultures which are thousands of years older than Western culture is, they've managed it for quite well, thank you very much. They don't stand in judgment over it.
Exactly right. I used to occasionally be at the Wycliffe site, Jules, for the preparation of short-term missionaries, and would be asked to preach. We'd always preach on Jesus in Luke, sending out the 70 or the 72. And I couldn't help myself but point out that twice Jesus says, eat what's put in front of you. Jesus is like your mother, and why? Why? Because actually that is accommodating yourself to somebody else's world. It's not passing judgment, it's not describing the people you visited as, oh yes, remember the people who eat spiders or monkey brains or something or other. No, it's the people with whom we had fellowship and with whom we ate. Footnote, yes, it was something that we would not otherwise have chosen. But it's quite a fascinating thing. And I think food and judgment are quite interesting metaphors in that space.
Oh, food's very significant cross-culturally, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it affects the way we smell. It affects the way we engage each other.
Yes.
And in these times when we're at home and we can only smell ourselves, that's another whole story. But we actually lose something about that diversity. We're not isolated by casting judgment on others, but some people do isolate themselves because they're unprepared to be contaminated by the smells, the tastes, the differentness, the different sounds of voices. It seems to me a tremendous tragedy. A distant relative of mine came back from Italy and said that she'd enjoyed it, but the place was full of foreigners.
Yes.
By which she meant Italians. Yes. Which meant she probably had not quite appreciated Italy.
Yes.
That's the worst of human judgment.
Yeah, and it was always the cliche growing up in the UK that, particularly in the 70s and 80s, if you went on a holiday to Spain, you had to find your way to a British pub or a British eatery rather than eat the local cuisine.
That's right. Because there's some sort of, there's an odd sense of contamination or, having to cross a boundary that might damage you or something. I don't know quite what it is, but we are herd animals, and we need our belonging. And I think one of the challenges in church communities is this sense of recognizing our odd distinctives, which I would always hope would be shaped around our calling and our mission locally, rather than being Anglican because we're not Baptist or we're not Catholic. Well, no, that's not the point. We're Anglican because, in my case, that's where I've landed. And that's the space I work out of. It's not working against others, often working with them. But it's working out of the call of Christ on our community to be who we are. And I think part of the discernment element of judgment, recognizing the diversity of others, is also recognizing their talents, their gifts. They do things differently to we do. The local Salvation Army is much more strongly connected into the court system. Why would we Anglicans try and do that? Let us continue with care for the homeless or whatever the different dimensions of our mission might be, you know.
So as you continued on in this course, did you find yourself bumping against a kind of fundamentalist mindset, or folks who've been hurt by a fundamentalist mindset that says that people over there are other, they're not in because they've not said a certain prayer of salvation or seen things our way or joined our community? Or was there any of that in your mind or going on as you continued on?
Yeah, there was certainly quite a bit of that. Oddly, the fundamentalism came not only from the church but from outside. One of my friends, and again Chatham House rule, but no names,
Sure.
had been seriously hurt and challenged by a friend who wanted to continue to say that Christianity was nonsense because it didn't stack up to the scientific paradigm. So that was the judgment of another being imposed on him, which he found incredibly painful because he sits in that space of high regard for science, but didn't want to answer in that regard. And so the fundamentalism, as it were, that came from someone holding tightly to a poor understanding, I would say, of the scientific worldview was very painful to him. And of course, there were some in the church who'd found that even asking questions was enough to find themselves marginalized from certain positions and certain relationships. It was not acceptable because questioning equaled doubt, doubt equaled lack of faith equaled you're not welcome here. At least that was the feeling.
Yes.
I think is for us to recognise that it's not only we who are in the midst of a struggle of faith, doubt and journey, but also those who are parts of our community, both church community and broader community, as well as our leaders. I think there's a risk that we assume that leaders have all the answers, and that's a terrible burden to put on leaders. So I think for us to sit in that space was pretty helpful. And to develop a certain amount of sympathy for others. One, if I could call it a device, I want to be careful about device, but one mechanism, if you like, that we used was to look at James Fowler's stages of faith. And there's a danger that you do that and then you dismiss everybody else that's in some sort of lower level of faith, which is entirely unfair. It's a bit like personality types, you know. It's about celebrating the difference, not finding superiority in one's own place. But once we opened that up a little and talked about the journey that many have from certainty to exploration to a greater openness and then to a willingness to embrace diversity and yet find one's own identity comfortably sitting in that space, I think a lot of people went, oh, that explains it. I see what's happening here in relationship with others or in their own journey. And that didn't solve any problems, Jules, but it opened up possibilities for further exploration for us.
Yeah.
This is the end of part 2 of a 3-part podcast talking with Dr. John Kappa about going beyond judgment. This is dchurch.com. Thanks for listening.